Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. The 1960s is famous for many things, notably movies. There was Midnight Cowboy, Easy Rider, Bonnie and Clyde, and a film said to be none more memorable nor more artfully directed than this one. That movie is The Graduate. With me to discuss the film today are two professors of psychology here at the college, Dr. Doug Pruitt and Sharla Krupansky. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
40 years ago, I graduated from high school, and this movie came out, and it was revolutionary, was it not? And today we were talking before the program, a lot of students have never heard of it. Why was this movie so pioneering, so groundbreaking?
Well, one of the first times in history that you ever hear about an older woman and a younger man and involved in some romantic tryst, and it was just unbelievable to be seen on the big screen, I think, at the time.
It still isn't all that common for it to be an older woman and a younger man. That's still fairly revolutionary.
Doug, you teach human sexuality. Do you talk about is there an older woman, younger man syndrome, if that's the term for it, or?
They call those
I really, don't think that you have any natural occurrence of that, but it makes perfect sense, really, in terms of hormonal peaks and sexual peaks as it goes with males and females, that of course young men at 17, 18, 19 years old are at their absolute sexual peak, and a woman doesn't even begin to peak until mid-30s, maybe all the way up into late 40s in life. So in a big way it makes sense in terms of the physical relationship that the two could have, but I think that we still have a society that frowns so heavily on such ideas that it's not a common.
And that's interesting about society, because now if an older man gets a younger woman, hey, that's big stuff. But if it's the other way around, society, it's almost like, well, that's Maggie May. Remember the song Maggie May and all
Absolutely.
that?
And it's always questioned. Why?
Right.
Why would you do that?
Exactly.
But whereas it's not questioned if a man's interested in a younger
We were
woman.
talking before the program, and you kind of compared this movie to The Summer of 42, which is made in 1971, which is also sort of the misadventures of young fellows with an older woman. It's a fascinating topic. The movie, you all, of course, saw it like I did years ago.
40 years ago.
Yeah, 40 years ago.
I want to think about that.
Why do you think it has such staying power? I mean, why are we celebrating? We're not celebrating the 40th anniversary of other movies, but this one in particular.
Well, still, as mentioned, it's iconic of the times, and it's I think it's still shocking to people even today that such relationships could exist or happen. And if you look in the news within the last 4 or 5 years, you see a few examples of teachers and their young male students, even all the way towards love and commitment and marriage.
But it makes the news, it's just a big
definitely still
news-making
hits the
thing
news,
for there to be a female teacher that has a relationship with a male student.
So but on the other hand, if it's an older man and a younger woman, that's just not as newsworthy.
Right. I mean, I think because if the girl was underage, it would still probably make the news, but people wouldn't question it so much. I think they would, under the table, they'd be like, well, that's understandable kind of thing, whereas they just don't seem to get it when it's the other way around.
Well, in a real way, it's a reciprocal relationship. It's the exact same thing. You've got a male that's old enough not to be at his peak sexually, clearly, in waning years, and a younger woman who's less interested in the physical nature of the relationship, perhaps more interested in something solid
and sees him
reliable.
maybe as solid, and whereas the kids her age aren't going to be. So.
Right.
We also talked before the program, and you see a link between the Kinsey report and this. Now, for those viewers who don't remember the Kinsey Report. That was quite a shock.
Absolutely.
What was the Kinsey Report?
That was the 50s, right?
Well, yeah, in the mid to late 50s, Kinsey had done a tremendous amount of research, going out and asking people questions that no one had ever asked before. At what age did you have your first sexual experience? When did you discover yourself sexually? What's your attitude about masturbation? Have you ever had a homosexual experience? What about straying outside of the marital bonds? Does that occur in everyday America? And the answers were all shocking to the public. Or maybe just seeing them on paper was shocking to the public. I'm not sure if you'd gone out and talked to the average everyday individual that they wouldn't have known these things were occurring, but perhaps the numbers were a little bit over the top for most. And most people would say that Kinsey ushered in the sexual revolution of the 1960s. If you look at William Masters, he used Kinsey as a model to a degree in that he established himself as a noted OBGYN doctor prior to getting involved in sexual investigations, because he wanted that sort of credibility and the age was enough so that he wouldn't be considered basically a pervert, you know, whereas Kinsey really took shots for his
And Kinsey was in Indiana, wasn't he?
I mean,
that's
yes.
middle America.
Yes.
And he was like biology teacher or something.
Yeah.
It was
Yes.
somewhat out of his area, not completely, but
Yeah, he
somewhat
had
out
a
of his
Harvard
area.
PhD in biology and had studied, of all things, gall wasps for years, and just got interested in the whole topic of sexuality. When his students were coming to him and asking him questions, and he had no answers, because no one had any answers to questions.
He had a hard time getting that class approved.
Oh, I
by the
remember.
powers that be.
Now there was a movie that came out about him. Now I believe, isn't there a 40th anniversary DVD out about the graduate so people can see it?
And they need to do that. I think this generation would still enjoy that movie because it still represents that moving away from parents and that whole idea of grappling with adulthood and what am I going to do, and feeling like you're lost and drifting and moving away from security. In the 60s, the addition in the 60s was the idea that the older generation just was completely wrong, you know, and the
never trust
youth,
anybody over 30.
Yeah, and the youth just had a totally different outlook, and that movie shows it so well because he comes from this upper class family, this really power-driven family. His father very career-oriented, and then he followed that all the way through college. Did lots of great things in college and all that stuff, and then he's done, and he's like drifting in the swimming pool and drinking beer.
Exactly. It's like he wants to postpone the next step.
And he just definitely knows. The only thing he knows is he doesn't want to be like Dad. You know, doesn't want that. That's all he can say. He doesn't know what he wants to do, but he knows what he doesn't want to do is, I want to be different.
Now that's typical of kids today, I guess.
Another huge theme. I think it's been typical of our history for.
That's why I think they would enjoy it.
Now the two stars are Dustin Hoffman, who plays Benjamin Braddock, the sort of hapless, drifting kid, and Anne Bancroft, who's the hot 30-ish woman. We were talking earlier. Some of the actors who were considered for this role and turned down, Warren Beatty, who was doing Bonnie and Clyde, and Robert Redford, and we all agreed Redford couldn't have pulled this off. He's too suave. He's too debonair. So, what was it about Dustin Hoffman that makes him such a believable character in this role?
He seems like that personality anyway. I mean,
isn't he just the everyday Joe that you run into?
Yeah.
Yeah. That is a little bit lost and might be absolutely shocked to find out what his prospects could be, or just perfectly illustrates your teenage, drifting, lost individual.
Who's been doing everything Daddy wants him to do all the way up until he gets out of college, and then it's like, now what? You know, now what do I do? I'm supposed to be separating, and I have no clue. You know.
Yeah.
Of course, plastics. That's the line. You know, I've got one, and that's. Why do you think that became such an iconic line? I got one word for you: plastics. And you hear it, people. Is it because it's just the absurdity of the whole thing? Plastics, one word.
Probably, but you know, during that time period, didn't plastics become? I mean, didn't it really become?
Yeah, huge industry.
Huge. And I think that probably that younger generation would have looked at that as being totally wrong. You know, you don't do that. That's like anti-green, anti-environment.
And something else I thought of. Well, I mean, and something that's plastic is not substantial. It's not real.
Just like Benjamin would have looked at his father's. Those were all his father's friends that were, you know, at his party, you know, and that's the way he would have viewed them, as plastic. Their world is not real. He wants something real.
From a psychological point of view, the way the character was portrayed, is it pretty realistic how a 21-year-old, 22-year-old kid out of college would react when this very attractive older woman approaches? What do you think? I mean, is that good psychology there?
I think at the time, absolutely. I'm not sure that you'd get quite that response today. We're a little more, the younger generation is a little more sophisticated in that nature, but in 1967, absolutely. I mean,
at first he's totally not going for this. You know, he's like, oh, no, 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 you know, trying to run. I mean, basically runs from her, but then gets sucked back in, you know? Like, so to speak.
I guess the image of that movie that everyone remembers is the crooked stocking-clad leg, which I brought here, and there is Dustin Hoffman looking sort of bewildered at it, and then we discovered before we went on the program that is not Anne Bancroft's leg. It is the leg of Miss Linda Gray, who played in Dallas. So we have that's kind of interesting. I thought an interesting twist on that whole thing. Today, and I don't know, I have a 14-year-old son, and if it seems that kids today think 30 is just ancient. It seems we're much more youth-oriented than maybe they would have been in the 60s. I don't know.
I think I thought 30 was ancient back then, too. When I was 14.
I did.
Yeah, okay. I wondered
about that. Was the age at which you could no longer trust an individual was 30.
That's true. So. That's true. But I just wondered if today, could that movie, if the movie had been made today, would it have been as big a hit today?
Well, they'd have to change it a lot. For one thing, they don't show a lot of those sexual scenes. They just leave that up to your imagination to fill that in, and they would have to show all that. They would probably.
So we would.
I think you would.
I think it would.
We would have to show graphic.
Absolutely.
Why is that?
I think so.
I mean, the imagination is a wonderful thing. You can conjure up all kinds of things to your imagination. Why are kids today? Why do they have to be so graphic?
Because that's what they're used to.
Availability.
That's what they've grown up with. Yeah.
It's such availability. It's there. No one's shut off from a view to the inner world of people and what they do, and it's not a guessing game anymore, or at least the age of that guessing is significantly lowered from where it was.
Personally, I like the guessing part. I think it's better when they don't show you everything and you get to, generate that.
Well, I guess to draw a parallel, and I've told students about this, is the movie Psycho. It really doesn't show anything, but the imagination is it's hideous, it's frightening, that music and all that. So left to the imagination, it can sometimes be worse than if you actually show it graphically. Getting back to the Kinsey report, here we have the Anne Bancroft character, who is this woman who apparently has everything. She's got a nice husband, nice marriage, who is looking to have a fling. Did Kinsey in his research, discovered there were a lot of women who were looking to do this sort of thing?
Certainly a much higher percentage than previously thought. Really, when Kinsey totally lost favor, if you will, is not when he put out his book, The Human Male, or The Sexual Male, but when he put out the book on women. It was not well received by those in power, yet the book sold 250,000 copies or thereabouts. So it was very popular with the public, but not popular with those in power. And it was exploring a lot more about what do women think about, what are women's sexual fantasies, if you will, what is
women
their
weren't allowed to have
proclivity
those, you know.
to
they were just
outside.
supposed to do whatever the man.
Yeah, really kind of officially ending the Victorian era to a large extent. Where, so it was a huge splash, and while they were fairly accepting of men, perhaps not being so straight and narrow, I don't think anyone wanted to hear.
They don't want their wife or their mother or their daughter to be
exactly.
And that's
sexual to anybody else. Anyway.
That brings up a fascinating point. Not to to make a long story bearable, as I tell my students. In going through the Iliad, it seems to me that you set the tone there for Western attitudes toward women for centuries. Greek males, Greek kings and warriors were perfectly free to have concubines and mistresses, but the wife is supposed to be faithful back home. Then you bring it to our society today. When a man gets married, he's supposed to have lots of experience. The woman isn't.
And a woman is much more likely to accept her husband's infidelity, but if a woman is unfaithful, the man can't. They don't typically handle that well.
Now, psychologically, why is that so?
It just goes right back to the same thing of male dominance. That it's a male-dominated society.
It is, and it's also. I mean, several people are going to argue this, that it's almost evolutionary in nature. Since the beginning of time, you're going to note that the differences in preferences, etc., between males and females are going to be based on entirely different things. That a woman is going to be looking for stability, support, so that the children are provided for, whereas the male is looking for what? More and more ability to pass on his genetic line. And how does he do that best? Obviously through multiple partners. And how does she do the best? Through one stable.
Not to give the plot of this movie away because people haven't seen it, but it gets very complicated when Benjamin falls in love with the daughter.
Exactly.
And again, I think the real charm of this movie. This is a serious subject, but it's humorous. And that's difficult to have a serious subject treated like that. But that is a real complication. I mean, here is mom, and they forbid him.
She forbids him. Mrs. Robinson forbids him. But Mr. Robinson doesn't know about the affair, so he actually is encouraging.
Exactly. He's clueless, and that adds for that. That's a lot of the charm of this sort of thing. And in the end, and we don't want to give the ending away, but it's a fascinating movie when you think about. So, any idea if you were, and they did discuss putting out a sequel to this movie. It never came to pass. And I don't know about you, but most sequels I find to be far inferior to the original. If you all could write a sequel to it, what would you do? What sequel would you have to that? I mean, in the end, there's Benjamin and Catherine Ross on the bus.
Now, see, you're giving away.
I'm sorry. They're just on a bus. They're on a bus. They're on a bus. I mean, it could be anywhere.
Well, there was a lot of discussion at the end of that movie as to the expressions on their faces and what, like, were they resigning themselves to the exact same life of their parents? So I guess a sequel could either totally break from that, what it looks like they're going to go right into the same life, and could totally break from that, or show us that it didn't really matter. You know.
Well, you could certainly explore the possibilities in their later life or their middle age, and now where is Catherine Ross and her attitudes, and does she have a graduate in mind?
Yeah, wouldn't it? And you know, what about Benjamin Braddock meeting up with Mrs. Robinson again at a later time? You know, the elder Mrs. Robinson.
And of course, they would have to. I mean, cross paths.
Right,
what
but I
one
mean,
would think.
meet up.
But yes, exactly. So they would be exactly. They would, yeah, so to speak.
Mother-in-law,
so to speak. Boy, that would be an interesting. Yeah. It is, and you go back to those movies I talked about, and those are some very powerful, very good movies with this. But I did read, by the way, that ending was sort of accidental. That they were shooting, and it was late in the day, and the director wanted to get through with this, and they just he thought that's a good ending. And I think lots of times in really good movies, this stuff is accidental or it's ad-libbed. And you can imagine Dustin Hoffman, it's facial expressions. He just comes across as this really likable, sort of hapless, clueless fellow who has been to a very good Eastern school, I suppose it's Williams College, and he seems to have everything going for himself. The movie also, sort of as a sidelight, popularized the music of
Simon and Garfunkel.
Simon and Garfunkel.
Yeah.
And that is sort of, when I read it, sort of accidental. They were just kind of cobbling together songs for it.
And actually that, most of the songs I think were already on
an
album.
They were.
Mrs. Robinson was really the only one that they wrote specifically for that. And I think that was kind of, the Mrs. Robinson part obviously wasn't accidental, but the rest of it, I think they just didn't get around to writing everything they were supposed to write. A lot of things I read about that movie did not go well the way that they projected. It's amazing that it worked out.
It was nominated for 6 Oscars, and Nichols won it for Best Director. So it had some pretty stiff competition that year. The song Mrs. Robinson, psychoanalyzed that song. What is Simon and Garfunkel trying to say in that song?
I don't.
All I can remember is
Here's
here's
to you, Mrs. Robinson. Jesus has a place for those who care.
Jesus loves you. I don't know.
Jesus loves you more than you know, or
that's
and then there's a Joe DiMaggio thing in there. Hey, where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? Of course, I've often wondered about a lot of songs.
Joe DiMaggio was not. He married to Marilyn Monroe.
He was.
He did.
And of course, Marilyn Monroe allegedly had the affair with the Kennedys, and maybe maybe the sexual tension is involved. I don't know.
The opposite, I guess. Age
of that. And then of course, I often wondered about a lot of songs. Do they just put that stuff in there, and they laugh and people make stuff of it because it means nothing. They just put it in there. Because in high school you have these symbolism, Moby Dick, and I often thought, well, this guy. Well, it's just a story about a whale. Make of it as you wish. And I really, it's just a whale story. I wondered about that. But again, the characters are absolutely perfect for this.
And I heard that, speaking of characters, that Doris Day was the original.
Can you imagine? Now that's great. Doris Day as the seductress.
Yeah.
Just couldn't fit.
I just don't see that.
She's like apple pie.
Absolutely.
The old wholesome image.
Blonde. And I mean, what would, that just wouldn't. But when you think of Anne Bancroft, she doesn't have these, she's not known for these roles as this very sexual, this very siren type role either. But she sure pulled it off. Yeah. She sure pulled it off. I mean, it just, you look at that movie and you think, how could it be anybody else than those characters, than they are. And by the way, one of the, you'll like this, I ran across a little bit tidbit that when they were considering characters for Benjamin Braddock, they considered a fellow named Burt Ward, who is Robin in Batman.
Oh, no.
I mean, how would that have worked?
Well, and he turned it down, and then he ended up typecast as Robin and never really did anything else.
As the Boy Wonder, and it's like, and you wonder.
It's just a little too tame.
I think you're exactly right. I think that he is too far off the scale the other way, whereas Hoffman, I think, he was perfect for this role. And but in reading this, all the spin-offs on this, he drove an Alfa Romeo car that had come out in 1966. This car's popularity zoomed. It's called a Spider. It just keeps on going. But I agree with your initial analysis. This is the 60s. This is what you do. You go to college. You get a good college education, and then you go into plastics or whatever.
Exactly.
But you know, a few years ago, Newsweek had an article about the drifting generation of today. That a lot of these kids, like Generation X, they're postponing adulthood.
Well, they're getting out of college and they just have no clue. I can look at my own family and see, nieces, nephews, children that are like that. They just don't, they can't commit themselves to a career.
But of course today, well, when we were younger, not quite the old days, but anyway, you trained yourself for a career, and you did that the rest of your life. But now these statistics are people change careers 2 or 3 times, and that's very common now.
And they change majors in college 2 or 3 times.
Absolutely.
Well, is it ever not the case where you have one generation who's strut their stuff, and the next generation that comes along just wants to somehow change from that? Whatever it is, let's just get away from that. And The Graduate's just a perfect example of that. Here's this young man who's the generation previous are all of these highly stable, this is the plan, we stick to it, we finish college, we go to work, and all of a sudden here's one who's completely breaking that mold, and at the same time we're breaking another mold, the whole idea that an older woman could be with a younger man, and it's all hugely popular to the younger generation that's saying, yes, establishment, down with the establishment. And everything else that's going on at the time with Vietnam and protests and just amazing. And really, in many ways, it's not the big splash or the hugest depart from norm. A couple of years later, 1969, you get a movie that maybe would have rocked the world but didn't. A real simple Ellen Funt movie. I don't know if you know where I'm going with this. It didn't win any awards or break the bank at the box office. What do you say to a naked lady?
Right.
In 1969, and it was your first really soft porn, if you will. It really wasn't pornography at all, but all these shots of women, in nude women, just in a humorous situation.
Yeah, he was the candid camera guy.
That's all I can think of him as. I didn't know he
did. And so you think maybe The Graduate opened the door to that?
I think it did in a lot of ways, because it started to open up that idea that some of these topics can be explored a little further.
When was Woody Allen's Everything You Always Want to Know About Sex But Are Afraid to Ask?
70.
That comes later, but you're absolutely right.
Somewhere in that, right. But you see a move in that direction with The Graduate and some of the other films.
Our direction is out of time, unfortunately. I enjoyed this very much. So, in the time we have left, why don't you go out and rent that movie, you young folks, I think, and see what we old people are talking about here. I think you might enjoy that. My guests today were Dr. Doug Pruitt and Professor Sharla Krupansky. I'm Barry Craig. We will see you next time.